Hi everyone and welcome to the Arkham Seeker. Today in this video we'll continue with our analysis of the core set player cards, this time with the Rogue class. Rogue is probably the hardest class to analyze because its philosophy is not as clearly defined as the other classes. For example, Guardians are protectors. They want to defend their teammates and they usually do it by fighting and defeating enemies. Seekers are the best clue gatherers in the game. Mystics are spellcasters. They love controlling the game and using their willpower for basically everything. Survivors are great at defending themselves and staying up by all means. However, rogues have different characteristics which are not always present in their characters and player cards, and it's even less defined in the core set. In general, rogues love taking risks. They want to gamble, to show off, and are great at escaping trouble, even at the expense of their teammates. Some of their tools are resource generation, evasion, and avoiding trouble. Although in the core set, even the designers were still not sure about their philosophy, so the player cards are going to be hard to analyze. So let's stop rambling about the class philosophy and jump into the card analysis. Starting with the Switchblade, a one-cost asset with an agility icon, item, weapon, melee, illicit, occupies one hand, it is fast, and for one action we can fight. If we succeed by at least 2, the attack will deal 1 additional damage. This weapon has a very interesting premise, which is being a fast weapon. This means that even if we draw or engage enemies, and we don't have any weapons in play, we can play the Switchblade from our hand without spending an action and without triggering attacks of opportunity. If the weapon was not fast, it would have costed an action and triggered attacks of opportunity. That's why it's important to play our weapons as early as possible, even before we draw the enemy, so this doesn't happen. However, the Switchblade lets us be more aggressive in that regard. Then, as always, we have to compare this weapon with the template, which is the 45 automatic. The Switchblade is way cheaper and it's fast, which is great. Then the ability doesn't offer a skill boost and only gives the additional damage in case of success by at least 2. This is a pretty poor effect because it's very hard to obtain the additional damage consistently, which is what you want in a weapon. Action compression is critical to win this game, and if a weapon doesn't offer action compression consistently, it's just bad. Besides, if you think about which characters have access to this weapon, which are Skids and Wendy in the core set, their combat skill is pretty bad. Even Skids with 3 doesn't have enough to consistently obtain the extra damage. Think about the enemies you have in this game. Most of them have a combat value of at least 3 or 4. If you want to succeed by 2, you need to have a fight value of at least 7 or 8, which is impossible to get consistently. In practice, this ability is not even better than a basic fight action, because it does basically the same, 1 damage, and also fills one of our hand slots, which are generally very important. So, in conclusion, this is probably the worst weapon in the core set, because it's almost impossible to obtain the additional damage consistently, and that action compression is critical in a weapon. It also relies on our base combat skill, so it's very hard to fit in any rogue character. Even Tony Morgan from the Dream Eaters expansion, who has a base combat of 5, would struggle to get the extra damage, although I have to say that the level 2 version of this card, which comes in Dunwich, is way better because it offers a +2 skill value, which makes it feasible, even good in Tony. It's impractical in any other character, and that's why I'm still baffled that they decided to include this card in Winifred's pre-constructed deck, as her base combat is just 3, and she also can't raise her combat value to consistently get the extra damage. Then we have the Burglary, a one-cost asset with an intellect icon, talent, illicit. For one action and exhausting the card, we can investigate. If we succeed, instead of discovering clues, we will gain 3 resources. So this card lets us exchange an investigate action for a gain of 3 resources. So we're talking about an economy card, whose main function is to generate additional resources. Up front, I really dislike cards like this. First, because it involves a skill test to gain something that we could also gain without a skill test, even less efficiently. We must be able to consistently pass that test if we want to gain a notable advantage from the card. And most of the time, a rogue character cannot pass this test reliably, because only a few of them can safely investigate, and because it also depends on our location's shroud value, which won't always be reasonable for a card like this. And secondly, because the card is still slow. You have to pay an action to play it, and then pay more actions to activate it. For example, you can gain 2 resources by paying 2 basic actions without any risk. If you want to use this card, you have to pay 1 resource and an action, and then activate it and pass the test for 3 resources, thus netting you 2, because you paid 1 for the card. It's true that you can activate the card more times in subsequent rounds, but I still dislike the unnecessary risk it involves. There are many safer ways to gain resources, even for rogues. I have to say that there are a few combos with this card which can be nice. For example, with Rex Murphy, because his personal ability can get you a clue anyway, plus the 3 resources. But I generally dislike these kinds of combos, more when the benefit is not that good. In general, although the card has the potential to be a good resource generation engine, first it must be used by a high intellect character, which is not common in rogues. And then you always have the risk of failure. Even a clue-gathering character doesn't want to spend actions in just gaining resources unless you want to create certain combos. But again, I prefer to play this game in a safer, efficient, and less crazy way. Let's move into Pickpocketing, a 2-cost asset with an agility icon, talent, illicit, with a reaction ability. After we evade an enemy, we can exhaust this to draw a card. This is basically a card draw engine, which is based in evasions. If we are a character that can evade consistently, we can trigger this card very frequently and gain a good benefit in terms of card advantage, which is great. In general, economy engines like this are pretty good, but only if we can keep them running. This means that this card is only good if we can trigger it frequently, almost every single round. If we don't, the card will not be worth it to include in our decks. So this card only fits in an evasion specialist, a character with an all-in bet for agility and evasion. There, it's good. Outside, even if you can evade, sometimes it's just not worth it. You have better alternatives to include in your deck. Overall, it's a good card engine in evasion specialists and too slow and unreliable in any other character. Then we have the 41 Derringer level 0 version, a 3-cost asset with a combat icon, item, weapon, firearm, illicit, occupies 1 hand, enters with 3 ammo, and for 1 action and 1 ammo we can fight. We get +2 combat for this attack, and if we succeed by at least 2, the attack will deal 1 additional damage. As always, let's compare this with the template weapon. This is 1 resource cheaper, enters with 1 few ammo, offers a bigger skill boost, and the extra damage is conditional to a margin of 2. So it's a very similar ability to the Switchblade, as the action compression, which is what we are looking for in weapons, depends on the margin of success. However, at least this card offers a +2 skill value, thus helping us to get the margin of 2. It still needs to be used by a high combat character to be reliable, but at least it's closer to being reasonable. And in practice, it can fit into some decks, but it's only optimal in a combat-oriented character, which in rogues is rare but not impossible. I think that Tony Morgan is the only good fighting rogue, and this card can be a good level 0 weapon for him. In general, I think it's a decent weapon for combat rogues, which are a rare breed but exist, and with them it's good for a level 0 weapon. Don't bother with this card if your character doesn't have at least a decent combat skill, and if you are building his or her deck around a fighting strategy. I think that it's insulting to have this card in Wendy's starter deck with a combat skill of just 1. It's just pathetic. They could have put at least a tiny bit of effort in designing these starter decks, more than when they are usually the first decks to be used by a novice player. Then we have Leo De Luca, a 6-cost asset with an intellect icon, ally, criminal. I've realized that I've been pronouncing the ally word wrong in the previous videos because the accent is different depending on if it's the verb ally or the noun ally. So in this context, it's always ally. Remember that I'm not a native English speaker, and this channel is like a personal playground for me to practice and improve these details. No? Leo De Luca occupies the ally slot and gives us an additional action on each of our turns, soaks for 2 damage and 2 horror. Up front, this guy is pretty expensive. 6 resources are a lot. But we have to weigh these resources against the benefit of the card, which is very nice, giving us an additional action each turn. Actions are our most valuable resource in this game, so gaining a 4th action on every single turn is just great. Although it's still a notable investment, and it's better if you play him as early as possible in the game. The more rounds you have him in play, the more extra actions you're getting for the same flat 6 resource cost. It also means that if you draw him late in the game, he's basically a dead draw, because if you only have a few rounds left, you're not going to pay 6 for just a few extra actions. It's just not worth it. In general, I like this card a lot, and it still sees play in many of my decks after having all of the expansions, because an additional action is such a nice effect that it's worth it even with the 6 resources. However, you have to be careful with your resource economy, because even if you play him early, which is advisable, you're going to burn a lot of resources that you're going to need for other plays. At least rogues tend to have access to great resource generation cards, so they can mitigate the 6 cost more easily than any other class. Let's move into Hard Knocks, a 2-cost asset with combat and agility icons, talent, which has 2 free triggered abilities that for 1 resource we get +1 to our combat or agility skill for a single skill test. Obviously, this is another sibling of the family of skill boosters by paying resources 1 to 1. So I'm not going to repeat myself. I've already analyzed this family of cards at the Guardian class video, so there's not much more to say. These cards tend to be very expensive, and even for rogues who tend to have a good resource economy, they can't afford a card like this. In general, they prefer to invest their resources more efficiently. The only difference between this card and its siblings is the 2 feature skills, which are combat, generally not useful unless you are a pure fighter, and agility, which can be nice for rogues and evading characters, but I think that they have more efficient ways of boosting that skill. As always, it's a typical filler asset for a level 0 deck, and it is easily replaced with more efficient cards. If rogues are not able to efficiently use a card like this, I think nobody can. Then we have Elusive, a 2-cost event with intellect and agility icons, tactic, fast card that can only be played during our turn, lets us disengage from each enemy engaged with us and move to a revealed location with no enemies. So this card offers 2 things. First, it releases all enemies engaged with us. So it's a nice emergency button if you have many engaged enemies. And second, it lets us jump across the board to any revealed location without enemies. And this, for me, is the main appeal of the card. Not only it frees us from enemies, it also lets us move potentially many spaces without spending a single action. So the ceiling of the card is tremendously high, to the point that some scenarios can be broken with this card. I'm not going to name examples to avoid spoilers, but some of them can be literally broken with this card. Of course, the design team devised this and tried to balance the card with the taboo list. There have been several iterations of the card, first by just increasing the XP cost, and now it just changes the ability text. Now, if you use the taboo list, and again, you don't have to if you don't want, and I advise against if you are not a veteran player, now you can only move to a connecting location, although it can be unrevealed. This tries to balance the card and make it less powerful, but it's still a nice effect that can be useful in certain scenarios or campaigns. Overall, as printed, this card is a staple in many rogue decks because of the potential movement, which can break the game in certain contexts. The taboo version is still nice, but it's not that powerful. More nowadays, with so many expansions released, the card has some competitors and it's not as widely played as before. Let's move into the Backstab, a 3-cost event with combat and agility icons tactic that counts as a fight action. It uses our agility skill instead of our combat, and the attack deals 2 additional damage. Upfront, I love the design of this card because it turns the agility skill into a one-time 3 damage attack, offering an excellent action compression effect. Even if it's a one-time effect, attacking for 3 damage in this game is very, very good. But beware that the card doesn't offer any skill boost, so you have to rely on your base agility for this test, thus limiting the card to characters with high base agility, although many rogues have it. As the card is a one-time effect, the test is very critical. You have to pass it whatever it takes. If you fail, the cost of opportunity is huge, as the difference between success and failure is very high. You should throw everything you have for this attack. And this is one of the few good definitions of the rogue philosophy in the game's early life. Cards like this are high risk, high reward. The potential benefit is huge. It's 3 damage for a single action, but it's a one-time effect. So if you fail, you are wasting one of your best cards. I have to say that cards like this have not aged so well, because some newer cards offer similar effects but way more efficiently. For example, you have the Spectral Razor in Mystic, which is a 2-cost event, also hitting for 2 extra damage, in this case only to non-elite enemies, but summing adding the willpower and combat skills, so the base skill value is much higher. Overall, the Backstab is still a nice situational tool for high agility investigators to deliver a 3 damage attack. As the card's ceiling is very high, it can be included in many decks, but make sure that you maximize the odds of passing the test, because failure is not an option when there's so much on the line. Then we have the Sneak Attack, a 2-cost event with intellect and combat icons tactic that deals 2 damage to an exhausted enemy at our location. So this card deals 2 straight damage to an enemy at our location, but only if it's exhausted. This generally means that the enemy has to be evaded before being able to use this card. If it's us who have to perform the evasion, this card still offers a nice action compression. For 2 actions, we've done an evasion and dealt 2 damage to the enemy, which is better than an attack and an evasion. It's not great, but can be worth it if you can evade safely. Although I think that cards like this only shine if you have a special synergy with it. For example, if you are Finn Edwards, who has an additional action each turn to evade, it can be a better play, because he's not using one of his 3 regular actions to perform the evasion. Or if you have Leo de Luca in play and you have the 4th action, the cost of opportunity is lower, thus giving this card a better value. Overall, effects like this that deal strike damage to enemies without taking tests are usually good, but in this case in particular you need to be a good evader, because the card doesn't work if the enemy is not exhausted. If you have a good action economy and you are an evasion specialist, this card can be pretty nice, but it's not worth it in other strategies. As always, the last level 0 card is a skill card, which is Opportunist. A skill card with a wild icon innate that can only be committed to a test we are performing ourselves. And if it succeeds by at least 3, we return this card to our hand instead of discarding it. So it offers a slight advantage to any type of test we are taking, and a possibility of rebounding the card to our hand if we get lucky with the bug. Here the issue is that in order to succeed by 3, we need to be very, very lucky or have a huge skill value. And here, if you only have the core set, it's very hard to raise your skill value to a value high enough to make good use of this card. In practice, you need to use effects that sum or combine 2 skills in order to obtain a good value, so the margin of 3 is reasonable. For this reason, this card is just unplayable unless you have a special synergy with skill cards. And I think that there's only one investigator in the entire game's history that can make good use of this card, and it's Winifred Havamok, the one from the investigator starter decks. And it's because she has a nice synergy with skill cards, and she also generally wants to raise her skill values to huge numbers, thus really benefiting from this card. Overall, it just doesn't offer enough value, and its good effect is almost impossible to get unless you are very lucky. It only fits in a deck with synergy with skill cards, and that can notably raise the skill value for single tests. In my opinion, Winifred is the only one who really fits there, and I don't see any other investigator that can actually make a good use of this card. Let's move into the level 1 plus cards, starting with an upgraded version of Leo de Luca, level 1 version, which just costs 1 less resource. The card is exactly the same, but now it costs 5 instead of 6. So you are paying 1 XP for a 1 resource cost reduction. It's not huge, not very relevant, but it helps to mitigate the huge resource cost of the level 0 version. In my opinion, it's worth it at any point of the campaign because it's very cheap in terms of XP, but I will never buy it before many other cards that are more important for my deck's strategy. It's a small difference, just 1 resource cheaper, so it's not great, but as it doesn't cost many XP, if you are running the level 0 version in your deck, I think it's worth it to pick the level 1 version at some point during the campaign, more on the mid to late part of the campaign. Then we have the cat Burglar, a 4-cost asset level 1 with willpower and agility icons. Ally criminal occupies the ally slot, gives us a static +1 agility, and for 1 action and exhausting the card, we disengage from each enemy engaged with us, and we move to a connecting location, and this doesn't trigger attacks of opportunity. Beware that if it didn't say so, it would trigger attacks of opportunity, because it's an action ability and it's not parley, resign, fight, nor evade. So he offers a static agility boost and an ability to move, leaving all our enemies behind. On the one hand, the static boost is always nice if the agility is your key skill. If you are building an evasion specialist, this card can be a good option just for the static skill boost. On the other hand, I am not sold on the second ability, because a card like this should appeal to evading characters, And they don't want to just leave the enemies behind, they want to evade them. And this effect doesn't really exhaust the enemies. For example, if they are hunters, they will move in the next enemy phase. So what's the point there? I've never seen it. I think that the ability is too situational to be worth the ally slot. Overall, I think that the static boost actually saves the card from being useless and can be used in an evasion specialist. But honestly, I prefer Leo de Luca before this card. I'd take the extra action over the boost and the ability, just because it doesn't really help for an evasion strategy, which is where the agility boost will be worth it. Then we have one of the reprints for the revised core, which is the Lockpicks, a 3-cost asset with an intellect icon, item, tool, illicit, occupies 1 hand, enters with 3 supplies, and if it runs out of supplies, it must be discarded. For 1 action and exhausting the card, we can investigate, and we add our agility value to our skill for this investigation. Generally, it means that we are adding the intellect and the agility. If we don't succeed by at least 2, we must retire 1 supply from the card. In my opinion, this is a very solid card and a nice reprint for the revised core, because it's a very nice card for any rogue character that wants to help with clue gathering, whether we are a specialist clue gatherer or just a support. Its only requirement is to have both good intellect and agility. I think at least 3 in both. But most characters that can take this card do have these skills. Also, the lifespan of the card can be a bit random depending on the lack of the chaos bug, but also on how you use it. You shouldn't use this card on very high shadow values, at least repeatedly, because you will run out of supplies. And the longer you keep this card in play, the better, because well used, this card almost equals to 1 clue per turn, which is great overall. In general, I think it's a great card for any character that wants to contribute to clue gathering, both for specialists and supports. And it works as long as the combination of intellect and agility is good, which is pretty common for most rogues. One of my favorite cards in the class. Then we have an upgraded 41 Derringer, a level 2 version. It has the same cost, same ammo, but the ability is a bit different. We still get the +2 combat, but now we only need to succeed by 1 to get the extra damage. Also, if we succeed by 3 or more, once per round we can gain an extra action. I think it's a very solid upgrade for the original card. It's easier to use as the extra damage is more reliable and the chance of an extra action is a nice added value. My only issue with the card is that its ammo count is quite low with only 3. It feels too low when you are paying 2 XP for the card. I think it's not a big deal in the level 0 version, but if you are paying XP for it, that low ammo feels worse in my opinion. Still, it's a nice weapon for any rogue fighter, although they can have alternatives in expansions. Even the upgraded Switchblade from damage is better, in my opinion. Overall, I think it's a nice upgrade of the original, because it's more reliable and has the potential of gifting an extra action. My only gripe is the low ammo count. So, if you want to bet for this card, you need to reload it. But note that the few characters that can use it, like Tony Morgan, can reliably reload it. So it's not a big deal, but still an issue that has to be worked around. Let's move into Sure Gamble, a 2-cost event, level 3, without icons, fortune, insight, fast card that can be played when we reveal a chaos token with a negative modifier. Doesn't matter if it's symbolic or numeric, as long as the modifier is negative. Switch the minus modifier to a plus. So this is a defensive card against the chaos bug, effectively neutralizing any negative modifier and even turning it into a positive. The more negative the number is, the higher the margin of success, which can be nice to trigger some effects that require margin of success, like the upgraded Derringer. I think it's a great card, but a bit expensive because of the 3 XP, and also a bit weird considering the rogue philosophy, as I explained at the beginning of the video. Rogues are gamblers, they don't want safety, they want risk, and this card is taking out the risk of the chaos bag, at least partially. So for me, it doesn't really feel as a rogue card. It feels more a survivor card. Rogues prefer high risk, high reward, not safety. Overall, I think it's an excellent one-time defense against the bug, but too expensive in terms of XP. It can be hard to justify the investment, but in some cases it may be worth it, although I don't usually take the card outside of very specific decks and characters. Finally, the last card for today is Hot Streak, a 3-cost event level 4 with a wild icon fortune that gains us 10 resources. Very simple and straightforward card that nets us 7 resources. We pay 3, we gain 10, thus netting 7. One of the most basic mechanics for rogue characters, which is generating huge amounts of resources also very efficiently. There's not much to analyze here, not much, but if the 4 XP investment is worth it. And if your deck requires a high amount of resources to work, the answer for me is clearly yes. In fact, it should be one of your key upgrades if your strategy involves generating and using lots of resources. For example, if you are Skids, you want the resources to trigger your personal ability and pay for the extra action. If you're playing around cards that are expensive, you need this card to pay for them, or at least is a good tool to use. In general, a bit expensive, I think it's a great card if you need the resources. I like it because it enables strategies that revolve around generating many resources, and for that reason enough, I think it's an interesting card. It's expensive in terms of XP, but as it enables strategies, it's usually a very important upgrade that you want to buy as early as possible in the campaign if generating huge amounts of resources is a key part of your strategy. So that's all for today. As always, I hope I've managed to express myself clearly. It's not easy to do in a language that is not that natural for me, but I like doing it, and I think it's helping me to become more clear and to be able to share my analysis of this beloved game with many more people. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you again in the next video of this blog, where we'll move into the Mystic class, one of my favorites. Again, thanks for watching, until we meet again here at the Arkham Seeker.